The Hartwell mansion was a gilded prison suffocating with loneliness, suspicion, and simmering resentment. From her balcony, Isabella Hartwell watched the town's highfalutin families gather for their weekly promenade, their whispers about her inheritance sharp enough to draw blood. She met their stares with unyielding pride, a queen surveying a kingdom that despised her. This vast fortune was a fortress, yet she'd never felt more exposed. Her secret goal wasn't to win their approval, but to find one thing, just one, that felt real in her life of polished lies. The next dawn she rode out, pushing her stallion hard against the wind. That's when she found him. Near the sacred rocks her father forbade her to trespass, a man lay broken. A warrior. An Apache. Every instinct screamed danger. The town would call it treason. But looking down at the enemy her world had taught her to hate, she felt the first spark of a rebellion that would either save her soul or see her hanged. The wind was a liar in this part of the territory. It whispered of coolness, of relief, but carried only the heat of the sun-scorched earth and the fine red dust that coated everything, including the silent scream in Isabella Hartwell's throat. Below her, nestled in the jagged shadows of the sacred rocks, lay the man. He was a tear in the fabric of her world. Her life was one of manicured lawns, polished silver, and the suffocating scent of judgment. His was of dirt, of blood, of a freedom so fierce it had broken him against the unyielding stone. He was an Apache warrior, the kind of man whose name was used to frighten children and rally posses. A ghost from the headlines made of flesh and agony. She should have turned her horse, the magnificent black Arabian that cost more than most men earn in a lifetime. She should have galloped back to the gilded cage of her mansion, bolted the doors, and forgotten what she saw. That was the Hartwell way. The safe way. He will die, a small cold voice of reason stated in her mind. But another voice, a newer one born of crushing loneliness and a desperate yearning for something real, whispered back. Let him. Her gloved hands trembled on the leather reins. She saw the sneering face of Alistair Vance in her mind's eye, heard the tittering laughter of his sisters. They saw her as a fragile doll, a lucky inheritor of a fortune she didn't deserve. They had no idea of the iron in her soul, an inheritance far more valuable than gold. It was that iron that made her dismount. The rustle of her riding skirt on the gravel was a gunshot in the silence. The man's head snapped up, his eyes glazed with fever and pain fixed on her. They were black, bottomless, and filled with a hatred as pure and primal as the landscape around them. He moved a guttural sound ripping from his throat as he tried to reach for a knife sheathed at his belt. Don't! Isabella said, her voice surprisingly steady, betraying none of the frantic pounding of her heart. She held her hands up, palms open, a gesture of peace, a gesture of utter foolishness. You'll only make the bleeding worse. His lips pulled back from his teeth in a snarl. Stay back, white woman. The words were a rough-edged rasp, each one costing him. My name is Isabella, she replied, taking another slow step forward. The stench of sweat and blood grew stronger. And you are on my land. It was a strange thing to say, an assertion of ownership at a time like this, but it was the only power she felt she had. He seemed to understand the claim, his eyes narrowing, not with less hate, but with a new, sharp curiosity. He was assessing her, the enemy. She knelt beside him, the fine fabric of her skirt immediately soaking up the dark, damp earth. Her gaze fell to his thigh, where a crude bandage of torn buckskin was soaked through with blood. A bullet wound, ugly and deep. I am not your enemy today, she said softly, pulling a clean silk handkerchief from her sleeve. It was absurdly delicate, a piece of her world about to be sacrificed to his. He watched her, his body tense, a coiled spring of pain and suspicion. All your kind are my enemy. Then let me be a different kind. Without waiting for permission, she reached out. her fingers still covered in fine leather gently pressed against the makeshift bandage. He flinched violently, a pained hiss escaping his lips, but he didn't pull away. It was a concession, a crack in the wall of his defiance. She worked quickly, her fear sublimating into a cold, focused purpose. She cleaned the edges of the wound as best she could, the pristine silk turning a sickening crimson. His breathing was shallow, his skin burning to the touch. He would not survive the night out here. The fever, or the wolves, or the posse that was surely searching for him would claim him before the moon was high. She had made her choice the moment she swung her leg over the saddle. Now she had to see it through. "Can you stand?" she asked. A harsh, humorless laugh was his only answer. She looked around, her mind racing. She couldn't bring him to the house. The staff, the Vances, the entire world would know within an hour. But there was another place. A secret place. The old springhouse tucked deep in the overgrown creek bed, forgotten for a generation. A place of cool stone and shadow where she had hidden as a girl to escape the world. It was there she would hide him now. "We're moving," she commanded, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Put your arm over my shoulder." The effort was immense. He was heavy, a dead weight of muscle and bone. She was strong, but she staggered under his mass, her boots slipping on the loose rock. Every step was a battle, a grunt of exertion from her, a gasp of pain from him. The smell of him, of dust and pine and blood, filled her senses. It was the smell of life, raw and unfiltered. By the time they reached the crumbling stone walls of the springhouse, hidden behind a curtain of weeping willows, she was drenched in sweat, her muscles screaming. She guided him through the low doorway into the cool, damp dark within. He collapsed onto a bed of dry, fragrant moss, his body shuddering. He was a secret. Her secret. A dangerous, bleeding secret that now lay at the heart of her world. As she barred the heavy oak door from the inside, plunging them into near total darkness, Isabella leaned against the cold stone, her breath coming in ragged sobs. She had not just brought a man in from the wilderness. She had invited a war to her doorstep. The darkness inside the springhouse was a living thing. It was absolute, ancient smelling of damp, stone-wet earth and the metallic tang of the man's blood. For a long moment, the only sound was the frantic drumming of Isabella's own heart, a frantic counterpoint to the man's ragged, shallow breathing. The war she had invited in was quiet for now. But it was here in this small, crumbling sanctuary of her childhood, and its first soldier was bleeding out on a bed of moss. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. "What have you done?" She shoved the thought away, pressing her back against the rough-hewn wood of the door as if to hold the entire world at bay. This was no time for regret. Regret was a luxury, a thing for tea rooms and quiet parlors. This was a place of action. "I need light," she said more to herself than to him. Her voice was a thin thread in the oppressive dark. Fumbling in the small saddlebag she'd had the presence of mind to unhitch from her horse, her fingers closed around a tin of matches. With a trembling hand, she struck one. The sudden flare was blinding, chasing the shadows into frantic, dancing shapes. In the flickering light, she saw him. He hadn't moved. His eyes were closed, now his face pale beneath its sun-bronzed hue, etched with lines of profound pain. A fallen eagle. There was a rusted lantern on a stone ledge, its glass clouded with the dust of ages. She lit the wick, and a soft golden glow pushed back the gloom, creating an island of light in the cavernous dark. It was intimate. Dangerous. A confessional where only one of them had sins the world would recognize. "I have to see to that wound properly," she said, her voice regaining its clinical edge. It was a shield against the unnerving reality of the situation. "This is going to hurt." He didn't respond. His consciousness was a flickering flame threatening to extinguish. She took that as her permission. Taking a deep breath, she untied the knot of the blood-soaked buckskin. As she peeled the material away, the wound was revealed, and it was worse than she'd imagined. The bullet had torn through the muscle, angry and inflamed. The flesh around it was hot to the touch. Infection had already begun its insidious work. Damn it all, she whispered the unladylike curse, a small rebellion of its own. From her saddlebag she produced a small silver flask. Not water. Whiskey. A gentleman's drink, now a tool of grim necessity. She looked at his face, then back at the wound. He stirred as she began to clean the wound with the fiery liquid. His eyes flew open, no longer just curious, but blazing with a delirious fire. He grabbed her wrist, his grip surprisingly strong, a band of iron. Giuntil Nutse. He rasped the words foreign, guttural. A prayer or a curse, she couldn't tell. He stared at her, but she wasn't sure he was seeing her. He was seeing a ghost, a demon from his fever dream. "Let go," she said, her voice firm, though a tremor of fear shot through her. "I am helping you." His focus sharpened for a second, the delirium receding, replaced by raw, biting suspicion. Why he breathed, his grip tightening. Why does a rich white woman dirty her hands for an Apache? The question hung in the air between them, heavy and sharp. She had no easy answer. Because she was lonely. Because she hated the brittle hypocrisy of her own kind. Because his defiance mirrored the one she kept caged in her heart. Because I will not have a death on my conscience. She said the answer, only a sliver of the truth. Or a ghost on my land. Now be still. She met his gaze without flinching, and after a long, tense moment, the iron grip on her wrist loosened. He fell back, his eyes closing, exhausted by the brief struggle. It was another truce. Fragile, unspoken. She worked for what felt like an eternity. She had no thread, no needle, only the whiskey to cleanse and strips of her own petticoat to bind. Her hands, usually accustomed to embroidery needles, and the delicate stems of wine glasses were now slick with his blood. She saw things she had only ever read about. An old faded scar that traced a line across his ribs like a pale snake. A small pouch tied with a leather thong around his neck that smelled faintly of sage and something else, something wild and unknown. He was a map of a life she couldn't possibly imagine. Just as she was tying the final knot on the clean white bandage, she froze. A sound from outside. Distant but unmistakable. The baying of hounds. Her blood ran cold. A posse. Alistair Vance no doubt had wasted no time. They were hunting. Not for a man, but for an idea, the idea that a native warrior could harm their world and survive. The sound grew fainter, heading west away from them. For now. But they would circle back. They always did. The world was not so large that a man like him could simply vanish. The shared danger settled back over the small room, a heavy blanket. The man on the moss bed was awake again, his breathing still labored, but his eyes lucid, clear. He had heard the dogs, too. "They hunt for me," he stated. It was not a question. "They hunt for a ghost," she replied, her voice low. "They will not find one here." He watched her for a long time, the silence stretching. He the hunted, she the traitor. Two sides of a coin no one in town would ever care to examine. "Chayton," he said, his voice quiet, stripped of its earlier hostility. Isabella looked at him confused. "What, my name?" "It is Chayton." She nodded slowly, the name settling in the quiet air. It had weight, a person, not a savage, not a ghost. Chayton. She knew then that this makeshift bandage would not be enough. The fever still raged in him. To fight it, she needed more. She needed quinine. She needed carbolic acid to properly clean the wound. She needed the tools her father, a physician in his youth, before he made his fortune, had kept locked away in a rosewood chest in his study. She had to go back to the mansion. She had to walk back into the gilded cage smile at the staff who watched her every move and steal from her own home. Looking at Chayton, whose life now rested so precariously in her hands, she felt a new cold resolve solidify in her gut. She had crossed a line. There was no going back. Her rebellion had just begun, and its next battlefield lay within the walls of her own home. The air in the springhouse had grown thick, heavy with the heat of Chayton's fever, and the unspoken fear that hung between them. To leave him now felt like a betrayal, like abandoning a flickering candle in a hurricane. But to stay was to watch him die. Isabella rose, her knees stiff, her resolve a cold, hard stone in her gut. Chayton's eyes, sharp and dark as obsidian chips, followed her every move. "Where do you go?" he asked, his voice a low rasp. The suspicion was back, a guard at the gate of his trust. "To fetch the proper tools," she replied, her tone clipped and practical. She couldn't afford emotion now. Emotion was a luxury that could get them both killed. "The fever will claim you long before that posse does if I don't. There is fresh water in the bucket. Do not make a sound. Do not even breathe too loudly." She didn't wait for his reply. She slipped out of the heavy oak door and back into the world, the encroaching twilight painting the sky in bruised shades of violet and orange. She was a ghost, leaving a tomb only to haunt the grounds of her own life. The journey back to the mansion was a disorienting passage between two worlds. Behind her lay the wild, untamed scent of wet earth and moss, a place of raw survival. Ahead lay the suffocating order of her home-manicured lawns, sculpted rose bushes, and the weight of 1,000 silent expectations. The springhouse had been a sanctuary. The mansion was now the battlefield. She did not approach the grand front entrance. She was a trespasser now. She crept along the edge of the gardens, a shadow moving through the familiar landscape that now felt alien and hostile. The sprawling house loomed before her, its windows like 100 unblinking eyes. Her home, a place she now had to break into. She found the small, rarely used conservatory door at the far side of the west wing. The iron latch, cold and familiar under her touch, groaned in protest as she turned it. The sound was a cannon blast in the silent evening. She froze, her heart leaping into her throat, and listened. Nothing. Only the distant chirp of crickets and the frantic pounding in her ears. She slipped inside. The air was thick with the sweet, cloying scent of orchids and damp soil. Moonlight streamed through the glass panes, casting eerie skeletal shadows from the exotic plants. Every creak of the floorboards under her ruined riding boots was an accusation. The portraits of her ancestors lining the long hall seemed to watch her with stern, disappointed eyes, a Hartwell skulking like a common thief. As she reached the grand staircase, a figure emerged from the dining room holding a candelabra. Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, a woman with eyes that missed nothing and a loyalty to the Hartwell name that was absolute. "Miss Isabella," the older woman gasped, her face a mixture of shock and concern. Her gaze dropped, taking in Isabella's appearance, the dirt-streaked face, the torn and bloodied skirt. "Good heavens, child, what happened to you? Are you hurt?" Isabella's mind raced, searching for a plausible lie. The truth was a wild beast, too monstrous to be uncaged. I took a fall," she stammered, hating the weakness in her own voice. "My horse was spooked near the ravine. I am unhurt, truly, just shaken and mortified," she added, forcing a small, wan smile. "I'll just go up and change." Mrs. Gable's brow furrowed with a sympathy that felt like a hot poker against Isabella's skin. "Of course, dear. Shall I have a hot bath drawn for you and some laudanum for the nerves?" "No," Isabella said, perhaps too quickly. "No, thank you, Martha. I just need to be alone for a moment." She hurried past, feeling the housekeeper's worried, probing gaze on her back. The lie felt thin, fragile. A seed of suspicion had been planted. She reached her father's study and closed the heavy door behind her, leaning against it as she caught her breath. The room smelled of him, of old books, leather, and the faint, sweet scent of the pipe tobacco he had favored. It was a room of comfort, of memory. And tonight, it was the site of her greatest treason. The rosewood medical chest was exactly where he had left it on the bottom shelf of his immense bookshelf. The brass latches clicked open, the sound deafeningly loud in the hallowed silence. Inside, nestled in worn velvet, were the tools of healing. Bottles of dark liquid, neatly labeled powders, sterile bandages, and a small leather roll containing gleaming surgical needles and spools of catgut suture. Her hands trembled as she gathered what she needed. The small, heavy glass bottles felt like weapons. Quinine for the fever. Carbolic acid to stave off the rot. This was it, the final, irrevocable step. With these supplies in her hands, she was no longer a woman who had stumbled upon an injured man. She was a conspirator, an accomplice. Clutching the stolen remedies to her chest like a prayer, she slipped out of the study and began the perilous journey back. Every shadow was a threat, every distant noise a footstep. Finally, she was outside the cool night air, a balm on her feverish skin. She ran her breath catching in her throat back to the sanctuary of the willows, back to the hidden stone door. She pushed it open, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. "I'm back," she whispered into the darkness. "I have what we need." The lantern still cast its weak golden glow, but the scene inside had changed. Chayton was no longer lying still. He was thrashing on the moss bed, his body racked with violent shudders. A low, delirious moan escaped his lips, the sound of a soul in torment. The fever had taken hold. It was at its peak. She had the tools to save him. But as she looked at the inferno of sickness that consumed him, a terrifying thought struck her with the force of a physical blow. She might already be too late. The air in the springhouse tasted of iron and fever. It was a suffocating, close heat, radiating not from the stone walls, but from the man who burned upon the bed of moss. Chayton was lost to the world, a ship tossed on the violent seas of a delirium that threatened to tear his body apart. He thrashed his powerful limbs fighting invisible enemies, his voice a low, guttural torrent of words in a language she did not know, a language of canyons and spirits and war. For a moment, Isabella was paralyzed by a wave of pure, unadulterated terror. The neat bottles and sterile bandages she had risked so much to retrieve suddenly seemed like children's toys against this monstrous, all-consuming sickness. Her father's knowledge was a ghost in a locked room. She was just a girl in a ruined dress standing at the precipice of a man's death. Then he cried out a name, a single sharp word of anguish that pierced through the fever babble. "Nejoni!" The sound broke her paralysis. It was not the cry of a savage or a ghost. It was the cry of a human heart breaking. And in that moment her fear was burned away, leaving behind the cold, hard ash of resolve. She would not let him be consumed. She uncorked the bottle of carbolic acid, its scent sharp and punishingly clean. This was her war now. She laid out the tools on a clean strip of her petticoat, a surgeon's needle gleaming wickedly in the lamplight, spools of catgut, fresh white bandages. She knelt beside him, the heat from his skin a physical force. "I'm sorry for this, Chayton," she whispered, knowing he could not hear. The moment the acid-laced cloth touched the angry, festering edges of his wound, he roared. It was a sound of pure, primal agony. He arched his back, his muscles cording as he fought her, his strength immense even in delirium. She threw her weight against his shoulder, holding him down, her own muscles screaming in protest. It was a desperate, intimate struggle, her determination against his pain, her will against his fever. "Be still," she grunted, her voice strained, tears of exertion stinging her eyes. "You have to be still." He continued to fight his fevered mind, lost in a battle of its own. "The blue coats," he gasped in English, his eyes wide and unseeing, staring at the stone ceiling above. "They burn. They burn the corn. The children." He thrashed again, his hand knocking over a bottle, the glass shattering on the stone floor. "Hush, now." Isabella found herself saying, her voice a low, soothing murmur. a stark contrast to the violence of her actions. "They are not here. You are safe." She was speaking lies, of course. He was anything but safe. But she was speaking them to the tormented spirit, not to the man. After what felt like an eternity, she finished cleaning the wound. It was raw, but it was clean. Now came the needle. She'd watched her father do this once on a ranch hand who'd been gored by a steer. His hands had been steady. Hers were slick with sweat. She took a breath and pushed the needle through the flesh. He did not roar this time. A long, shuddering groan escaped his lips, and his body went rigid. His delirious muttering softened, turning to whispers of a different kind. He spoke of wind, of a running stream, of an eagle soaring on a thermal. He was retreating, finding a place in his mind where the pain could not follow. As she worked, pulling the sutures tight, creating a neat, ugly seam where there had been a gaping wound, she listened. She was a trespasser in his memories, piecing together the fragments of a life. He spoke of his mother's hands, of the taste of pine nuts, of the first horse he had ever ridden. Small, beautiful things that his tormentors could never burn or take away. The final most difficult task was the quinine, the bitter life-saving powder. She mixed it with water, the resulting concoction a murky, unappetizing gray. She cradled his head in the crook of her arm, his sweat-soaked hair rough against her skin. "You must drink this," she urged, touching the cup to his cracked lips. He turned his head away, a reflexive rejection. She persisted, her touch gentle but firm, murmuring to him, not as a captor, but as a caregiver, as a last resort. Finally, a small amount of the bitter liquid passed his lips. Hours bled into one another. She bathed his face with cool water from the spring, her own body aching with a weariness so profound it felt as though her bones were dissolving. She did not sleep. She watched. She listened to the storm inside him rage and shudder and fight. And then in the deepest, darkest hour before the dawn, a change. The violent shudders lessened, softening into mere tremors. The harsh, ragged breaths that had been torn from his lungs began to deepen, evening out into the slow, steady rhythm of true sleep. She laid a hand on his forehead. The raging fire was gone, replaced by a simple human warmth. The fever had broken. Isabella sagged the strength, leaving her in a great shuddering wave of relief. She slid down to the floor, her back against the cool stone wall, her head resting just inches from his still form. She was too exhausted to move to even think. She had fought a battle with death in this small, dark room, and somehow she had won. As the first pale fingers of dawnlight pierced the cracks in the old oak door, Chayton's eyes opened. The delirium was gone. They were clear, calm, and focused directly on her. He took in the scene, the shattered glass, the blood-stained bandages, her own exhausted and disheveled form. He looked at her, truly, looked at her for the first time since this ordeal began. His lips moved, his voice no more than a dry whisper, but the words echoed in the stillness of the springhouse with the weight of a treaty. "You stayed." The dawn light filtering through the dust-caked cracks of the springhouse was soft and forgiving. It painted the stone walls in pale gold and illuminated the profound stillness that had settled in the wake of the fever's storm. Chayton's words, "You stayed," echoed in the quiet space not as an accusation, but as a statement of a truth so heavy it seemed to alter the very air she breathed. Isabella, weary to her bones, simply nodded. She pushed a stray lock of hair from her face, her fingers coming away smudged with dirt and dried blood. "I could not leave," she confessed, her voice a low whisper. It was the simplest, most honest thing she had said in years. She rose, her body a single unified ache, and dipped a clean cloth into the cool, clear water that trickled from the spring into a stone basin. She offered it to him. This time there was no hesitation. He took it, his fingers brushing against hers. The touch was fleeting, accidental, but it sent a jolt through her, a warmth that had nothing to do with fever, and everything to do with the man whose life she had held in her hands. He drank deeply, the water seeming to restore not just his body, but some essential part of his spirit. He leaned back against the wall, his gaze traveling around the small subterranean room. This place, he said, his voice stronger now. It is old. It was my hiding place when I was a girl. Isabella admitted a rare glimpse into her own cloistered past. I would come here to read, to escape the endless dinners and the silence of the house. She met his eyes. It seems it is a hiding place still. A long, comfortable silence grew between them, a new kind of quiet, not of tension, but of shared space. She found herself wanting to know more, to understand the map of the man behind the warrior. In your fever, she began, her voice hesitant, feeling as though she were trespassing on sacred ground. You spoke a name. Nijoni. His body went still. His gaze drifted away towards the slivers of light piercing the door, as if looking back in time. The muscles in his jaw tightened. She thought he would not answer, that she had pushed too far, broken the fragile truce. She was my sister, he said finally, his voice flat, hollowed out by a grief that was clearly still a raw, open wound. The soldiers came to our winter camp. They said we had broken a treaty that was written in a language we could not read. He stopped, swallowing hard. They burned everything. The corn, the lodges. Everything. He looked back at her, and in his dark eyes she saw the reflection of a burning world. Nijoni. She was quick, but she was not quicker than their bullets. The words struck Isabella with the force of a physical blow. Her own long-buried grief for her little brother taken by a fever in a nameless town rose up to meet his. It was the same loss, the same helplessness, the same gaping hole left in the fabric of a family. They were from different worlds, born to be enemies, yet they were bound by the universal sorrow of a stolen sibling. She had no words of comfort to offer. Platitudes would be an insult to the depth of his pain. So she simply sat with him in the shared, hallowed silence of their grief. Later, she retrieved the last of her provisions from her saddlebag, a piece of hardtack and some dried jerky. It was a pathetic meal, a pauper's fare. She broke the biscuit in two and handed him a piece. He took it. They ate together, the simple domestic act, a profound statement in the belly of their dangerous reality. As she watched him, she no longer saw a savage, an enemy, or even a patient. She saw Chayton, a man who knew the names of the wind and had lost a sister, a man whose hand had brushed hers and set her skin alight. And in the quiet of the dawn, in her hidden sanctuary, Isabella Hartwell finally admitted a terrifying, exhilarating truth to herself. Her rebellion had started as a protest against her world. It had now become something else entirely. It was for him. The spell was shattered by a sound from without. Not the distant baying of hounds, but something closer, clearer, and infinitely more terrifying. A woman's voice, sharp with worry. "Isabella, Miss Isabella, are you out here by the creek?" It was Mrs. Gable. The world had found them. The housekeeper's voice sliced through the quiet sanctuary, a sound as sharp and unwelcome as a rifle crack. "Miss Isabella, are you out here by the creek?" Every muscle in Chayton's body tensed. He moved with a startling, fluid grace, rising from the moss bed to a defensive crouch, the old hunting knife appearing in his hand as if by magic. The warrior was back, weak but unbroken, ready to meet his end. The peace of the dawn was a memory. The war had arrived. "They have found us," he whispered, his voice a low growl, his eyes fixed on the heavy oak door. Isabella's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. This was it, the moment of reckoning. She could stay hidden, let Mrs. Gable's worry turn to panic, and buy themselves a few more precious hours. But that was the old way, the way of a girl hiding from the world. She was not that girl anymore. "Stay here," she commanded, her voice imbued with a new and startling authority. Do not show yourself. This battle is mine to fight." She took one last look at him, at the fierce protective glint in his eyes, and stepped out into the blinding morning light. Mrs. Gable stood by the willow trees, her hands wrung together in her apron, her face a mask of frantic relief. "Miss Isabella, thank the Lord your bed was never slept in, we thought. With the posse still about—" Her words tumbled out, but her relief quickly soured as her gaze swept over Isabella's ruined, blood-stained dress. Suspicion, sharp and fearful, clouded her eyes. Before she could voice it, another figure emerged from the path leading from the main house. Alistair Vance. He was not frantic. He was calm, smug. A predator who had finally cornered his prey. Two burly men, hired guns by the look of their cold eyes, flanked him. "Well, well, Miss Hartwell," Vance drawled, his lips curling into a triumphant sneer. "Enjoying the morning air? Or have you been entertaining a guest?" Isabella's spine went rigid. She did not retreat. She did not falter. "My land is my own, Mr. Vance, as is my privacy. I suggest you remember where your property line ends. I think the whole town has an interest in who you shelter." He shot back, his smugness hardening into menace. He took a step toward the springhouse. "We're hunting a murderer, an Apache savage. Funny how the posse lost his trail right at the edge of your private land." He lunged for the door. "No," Isabella cried, moving to block his path. But she was too slow. One of his men shoved the heavy oak door inward with a brutal kick. It flew open, crashing against the interior stone wall. And Chayton was revealed. He stood in the center of the room, framed by the darkness, not crouching but standing tall. He was pale, his new bandage a stark white against his skin, but the knife in his hand was steady. His eyes burned with a fire that defied his weakness. A collective gasp went through the small crowd. Mrs. Gable's hand flew to her mouth, a choked sob escaping her lips. "There he is!" Vance roared, his voice thick with victory. "The beast in his den, and the traitor who harbored him, take him." His men raised their rifles, the metallic clicks of the hammers echoing in the sudden terrible silence. "No!" Isabella's voice rang out sharp and clear as a bell. She moved with a speed she didn't know she possessed, placing her own body directly between the rifle barrels and Chayton. "You will not touch him." Vance laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Step aside, Isabella. Don't die for this animal." "He is not an animal," she declared, her voice ringing with the force of absolute conviction. "He is a man, and he is under my protection. On my land." She locked her gaze with Vance, her eyes blazing. "Land, I might add, that is governed by a treaty your kind has conveniently forgotten." A flicker of confusion crossed Vance's face. "What nonsense is this?" "It's the truth," Isabella said, her voice dropping each word, a carefully placed stone building a fortress around them. "My father was not a thief, Mr. Vance. He was an honorable man. He signed a binding treaty with Chayton's people. It guarantees them safe passage and protection on this specific parcel of land. It is a legal document filed with the territorial government. A document that predates your father's grubby land grant by a decade." She was bluffing about having the paper in hand, but not about its existence. She spoke with the unshakable power of truth. "Harm him here, and you will not just face me. You will face the United States government for breaking a federal treaty. Your family will be ruined. I will personally see to it." The hired guns hesitated, looking at Vance. This was more complicated than they'd been paid for. It was Mrs. Gable who sealed Vance's defeat. The housekeeper, her face pale but her eyes fierce with a renewed loyalty, stepped forward to stand beside Isabella. "She is telling the truth," she said, her voice trembling but strong. "I saw the chest with the official seal myself in Mr. Hartwell's study years ago. He was a good man. He kept his promises." Faced with two women of unshakable resolve and the threat of legal obliteration, Alistair Vance's smug facade finally crumbled. He stared his mouth agape, defeated not by a bullet, but by a dead man's honor. With a curse, he spun on his heel, his empire of lies turning to dust around him. "This isn't over," he spat before storming away, his hired guns trailing uselessly behind him. In the ringing silence, Isabella turned back to the man in the doorway, the warrior who had watched her fight a battle for him with words, not weapons. The days that followed were quiet, a fragile peace settling over the Hartwell estate, and in that quiet a plan was forged. Weeks later, Isabella and a healed, strong Chayton stood on the hill overlooking the creek. Below the springhouse was no longer a hiding place. It was the center of a new beginning. With Hartwell funding and Chayton's leadership, the first structures of a new independent settlement were taking shape, a place for his people to live freely, protected by the treaty, a bridge between two worlds. "Your father was a man of great honor," Chayton said, his voice filled with a reverence that touched her soul. Isabella looked from the growing settlement to the man standing beside her, no longer a secret, but her partner, her future. "He knew the value of a promise," she replied, a genuine smile finally reaching her eyes. "Now we will build a new one, together."